Welcome to Moravian Mornings, the podcast where we explore the lives, history, and culture of the Moravian settlers in Wachovia, North Carolina, and the greater Moravian world. I'm your host, Savannah Franz. Today on Moravian Mornings, we'll learn about the origins of the Moravian Easter celebration and what its evolution in Wachovia can tell us about the changing spiritual and social realities of Black Moravians in the South. By tracing changes in the sunrise service, we'll explore how Southern Moravian communities moved from islands of relative integration to full segregation as white Moravians in the South adopted the overtly racist customs and ideas common among their neighbors. Guiding us through his research on this topic is Dr. Grant McAllister. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. McAllister, and welcome to your beautiful dog, Hannah.
Thank you.
So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am a German professor at Wake Forest University, and I started, I arrived at Wake Forest in 2001. So I've been here 25 years now in the area, and I specialize in 18th century German literature, in particular Romanticism. It was only later, around 2015, 2016, that I really started getting into Moravian studies.
Interesting. So I am curious on how you found the niche world of just general 18th century German literature?
Yeah, so 18th century, and that's due in a large part or to a large degree to a wonderful professor whom I had. Martha Helfer, yeah. She got me really excited about Enlightenment, German classicism, and especially German Romanticism. And so during my graduate studies, I just gravitated toward that direction. And that's, so it was due to, I guess, the influence of a teacher.
How did you find the world of Moravian history after that?
So I was actually interested in looking at some original documents from some writers of the 18th century and the early 19th century, in particular Heinrich von Kleist. And I had planned to go to an archive and look at some personal letters, but of course it was written in script. So I wanted to learn how to read the script, and I can't remember how I found out about Paul Poiker's class in Bethlehem at the Moravian Seminary up there. So that's what I did. I went up there, signed up for a class, and it was so great. He does such a good job with the class, and he does a really good job introducing Moravian history as well as the script. And so I thought, wow, this could be really interesting. And there's an archive in Salem. I wonder if I can go in there and see what I can find. I think part of being a researcher is just having a good degree of curiosity. And I was really curious what I could find in the archives in Salem. So that's really how it started.
Yeah, and you already live here, so
exactly.
We have this wealth of 18th century and the 19th century, German language colonial people and writings. So
yeah, I mean, people don't realize that in this area in the 18th century, 1750, really probably up until the 1820s, German was probably the most predominant language in this region. That's what so many people were speaking. And as a Germanist, of course, I find that fascinating. And it's fun to go back and read the documents and to immerse yourself into that culture via these documents and get an opportunity to listen to these people speak. And that's another thing about having the actual German text and not a translation is you're dealing directly with that person and that person's voice, which is really interesting.
So in your article, you're tracing the changing landscape of Moravian identity over time through their unique Easter celebration and the Moravians in Wachovia's eventual assimilation into the broader American identity. Could you possibly start at the beginning and paint us a scene of the very first Easter celebration that would later become tradition?
Sure. So as you know, Moravians and a lot of German communities do this. They document everything. And so this first experience was documented. I don't know exactly when it was documented, if it was documented the next day, but nonetheless, it was documented. And it was basically an impromptu visit to what they called God's Acre. Their resting place is the word they use actually in that document there. In 1732, they had gone out that night and they decided to watch the sunrise and to sing some hymns at the graveside of someone who'd passed away. It was, I think it wasn't until 1730 that someone even passed away. So in 1732, they went up to God's Acre, watched the sunrise, and sang some hymns, came back to the Saal, the hall, and had some more prayers. And it turned out to be a very important event for them, edifying and moving spiritually for them, and it was something that was then repeated the following year. The first time it was done, it was just a group of single brothers, young men at the time. I don't think they had set up the choirs yet. I'm not great with dates. But at some point, the choir system was then set up. But it was basically single brothers or brethren who went there. The following year, they included then women. And so it was a congregation-wide event at that point, or a much bigger event. And a year after that, it was even raining, and I found that significant that weather didn't even stop them from doing this service. So by that time, it had become a really important and meaningful ritual that was becoming a tradition. Shortly after that, then we have the salient features, the gathering before sunrise, the call with the trombones, the statement, "He is risen indeed," the procession to God's Acre, the litany there in God's Acre, the procession back, and singing hymns and more activities done in the Saal. So the development of this impromptu visit to God's Acre, and within probably 3 years, the actual structure of the event as we know it today had been solidified. And another really interesting fact is within very few years, it had migrated to the various congregations where the Moravians had started their missionary work, so basically around the world. So by that time, the sunrise service had become very much a Moravian tradition, very important Moravian tradition.
I found it fascinating that it started as a spontaneous event done by a bunch of young dudes going out in the early morning to then within a few years being codified by Zinzendorf.
Yes.
To then, as you said, expanding to the greater Moravian world. And as you mentioned in your article, by 1753, when the Moravians were here in Bethabara, they celebrated it year one.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes they didn't go visit God's Acre because sometimes it took a couple of years for the graveyard to get established or for someone to pass away.
One point I find fascinating in your article and that you just brought up is illuminating the participation of women in the celebration, but contrasting the lack of an active role with the biblical precedent of the holiday, with Mary of Magdala actually bearing witness to the empty grave and seeing the risen Christ. Does this speak in any way to the broader relationship Moravian women had with their communities and roles as they embodied them?
Yeah. The Moravian Church very much had a patriarchal order to it, but Zinzendorf in particular allowed women gave women a lot of agency in the early Moravian Church. Craig Atwood talks a lot about the importance of the mother and the celebration of the mother. The Holy Spirit was considered feminine. There are some really interesting aspects about the earlier structure of the Moravian congregations that gave women a lot of agency through the general economy. They hadn't been confined to the home or to a more domestic lifestyle. They actually had pretty important leadership roles ordained. So that was another thing that Zinzendorf was for. And with his death in 1760, it's interesting that the church moved really quickly to get rid of a lot of this, or a lot of the participation, the leadership participation of women in the Moravian church. We see that disappear fairly quickly with the Synod of 1764 and subsequent synods where their active role was diminished and really basically disappeared by the 1770s. The reference that you're referring to was an interesting reference from 1822 when they talked about possibly having women lead the procession to God's acre with the biblical importance that women played with the resurrection. And I can't remember exactly, I could look in the book, I guess, what the vote was, but only 2 voted for it. It was like pretty overwhelmingly, like 34-2, or maybe it was even higher. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I just remember that only 2 voted for it. So the idea was turned down, basically. And I think that's just a reflection of how patriarchal the church became after Zinzendorf's death, when in the beginning it had maybe a lot of promise. In many ways, I think the church had a lot of promise for racial equity and for gender equity that disappeared through the years.
It is interesting to see that, like, in Moravian communities, that it seems like they actually in some ways started relatively more progressive
Yes.
on subjects around race and sex, and then really, like, as they spread further out into the world, had less kind of authority from Herrnhut, and also Zinzendorf dying. I think it changed a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was heavily criticized for some of these ideas that it had. And after Zinzendorf's death, that was one thing that they were trying to address, was the criticism for some of these, I guess you'd call them outlandish ideas of female agency, and integrated church services. They were trying to create an image that was less disturbing or less foreign to other Lutherans or other Protestant denominations. They were trying to fit in, basically, is what they were trying to do, and remove some of the negative attitudes that they had. And so, they're getting rid of the general economy, they're getting rid of female agency, and then started actively participating in segregating their once relatively integrated society, especially in terms of religious services, I will say.
So you observe the notations about the Easter sunrise service became less about intra-congregational happenings to more commentary about outsider participation, or perhaps notation of intra-community differences. What are some of the observations that stood out to you?
The sheer number of visitors that came. I think that's the big thing, is that I don't think Moravians would have expected that the sunrise service would have been the draw that it became for non-Moravians. That's what stands out, is that eventually the diarist no longer is recording kind of intra-community or intra-congregational interest. They start talking about how many foreigners came, how many non-Moravians came, how many visitors they had. And these visitors, the numbers were not small. They're in the hundreds for a small community at that time to house, and they're staying in the neighborhood or around the congregation until the event takes place. They come a couple of days before, that's what stands out. That's what really surprised me, is the number of visitors that came, and also the problems that these sheer numbers created.
So you mentioned the large crowds of non-Moravians and their unruly behavior, specifically once in 1791 that compelled Salem Moravians to literally cancel the sunrise service on God's Acre. Do the records explain what this unruly behavior was?
They hint at it, and it's obviously drinking. And so, the reason why one can understand or guess that it's drinking is that they closed the tavern, and so they try to prevent the sale of alcohol and the days preceding the sunrise service. So it was probably becoming a little bit the way that Christmas had devolved into a raucous celebratory event, and maybe was losing. I guess Christmas was always, in its pagan origins, maybe a little bit raucous, but it was maybe, according to the Moravians, losing its spiritual importance, and they were a little uptight anyway, in like structure and all of that. So maybe that was a little off-putting for them. I think what is also interesting, the one thing I found, is that at this time, in the 1770s and into the 1780s, the visits kind of went down. But 1770s, 1790s, they didn't go to God's Acre, but once the visitors had left, they would go up. And so there was still kind of this concept, well, we're putting on a performance for our visitors, but there's also a central core intra-Moravian congregational event that we want to continue in peace and among ourselves. So I thought it was interesting that occasionally during these kind of raucous times, most of which took place in the 1790s, there were a couple years where they didn't say, they were like, no, we're not going up to God's Acre, we're not doing the procession. Then once all the visitors leave, then they actually went up there.
Sneaky.
Yeah.
What do you think compelled non-Moravians to be so fascinated by this event, to literally travel to this kind of quote-unquote strange community to them and participate in this event?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Obviously it is of central importance for Christianity, the event, and so it's already imbued with that significance. But I think a sunrise, just viewing a sunrise, has this edifying effect on people. I think there have been studies done that it releases serotonin. It makes people feel good. And so when you already have this religious significance tied to this massive release of serotonin when you watch a sunrise, and the way that the Moravians had structured this, it had this sense already of being maybe an ancient ritual. The Moravians like to talk about how they're the descendants of Jan Hus, and so it kind of has this tie to the old church, the original church, and maybe this event is actually tied to old Orthodox tradition. And I think other denominations saw this as potentially a realization of the myth of the original, and so this is the original church. So it had a sense of originality to it, or naturalness. That's my guess. But, this never mentioned. But I think there are a lot of aspects to the just watching a sunrise itself and the religious significance and the way the Moravians painted their church as being tied to an older, original Jan Husian Hussite event is significant.
I was really curious on what your speculation would be on that, because I was drawn like half between being like, yeah, like people crave ecstatic religious experience in ritual,
yeah. Uh-huh.
Especially one that feels quite ancient.
Yeah.
And half being like, party's a party.
Yeah.
And people want to get together.
Absolutely.
That's part of it. But thank you.
Yeah.
So, did Wachovia Moravians in the 18th and early 19th centuries, did you ever notice that they expressed regret about the changing of the Easter service from seemingly a more intimate service within the Moravian community to eventually an event geared to many non-Moravian visitors who attended?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can glean that there was dissatisfaction with the way it had potential to devolve into just kind of a 4th of July type celebration, losing its religious significance. And I think we can see that in the decision to not go to God's Acre. They wanted to make sure that procession to God's Acre was very orderly and had very imbued with religious significance, and nothing secular. That needed to be, I think, utmost importance for them to maintain that character. So I think, and then also that they went up there on their own, that was maybe something that they regretted. I don't think there's anything direct in the record where they say it's too bad that these visitors are coming, because of course their goal was to be a mission and to evangelize and bring the word of the gospel to as many people as they could. And so, I think they still saw this as a necessary tribulation that they had to endure, or that they would gladly endure, in order to realize their main function, which was evangelizing. So, I think they were torn between keeping it the character that they wanted it to have, and the pressure of the numbers coming in from the outside.
Do you think the American Revolution impacted the Wachovia Moravians in relation to their community and the emerging nation?
Without a doubt. That's possibly the biggest event that changed what happened to the Moravian congregation, without question. One of the biggest issues was the lack of communication. So they were literally broken off from the other communities in Europe. Lack of communication with them. Frederick Marshall was absent for the first few years of the war. I don't think he was able to come back, returned to 1778. So from 1775 through 1778, he was gone. And so they were forced to kind of become independent, to make their own decisions, and to not refer or to acquiesce to the authority in Europe or at Herrnhut, and so they were forced to make do, to grow up, kind of to become an independent congregation while the war was happening. I think that's a huge change, and then also changing from it being under the rule of the British to the rule of the Loyalists, the emerging nation, which was redefining property rights, and they were wondering, well, what's going to happen to Wachovia? This is a piece of land that we had bought from the British, and the Americans, the Loyalists, were like, well, all of these contracts are null and void. they don't mean anything anymore. So they had to fight to get their land deeds. And I think that had an impact. And then the whole American definition of private property, as opposed to the aristocratic idea of property that they were working under when they were subjects of the British Crown here. And so, yeah, without question, the revolution changed the attitudes. They saw that they could be independent. They got their independence, and they didn't want to give it back once they had gained it. I think that's what happened.
I really think that the Wachovia Moravians are such an interesting example of this group that during the American Revolution had to contend with this idea of independence and perhaps even like a self-sufficiency in both a literal material way. They were cut off from their worldwide support system and leadership in Europe for the first time, and also ideologically. I mean, this entire war in terms of rhetoric was circling around this notion of independence.
Yes.
So from two fronts, these people who are living a very different lifestyle than most, perhaps, this early nation is perhaps trying to cultivate. It's really interesting on how they start to change directly afterwards and pretty quickly.
I agree 100%. And I also think it's important to mention that they were the one functioning trading center in North Carolina. So the economic benefits of that had to have an impact on how they perceived themselves and what they wanted to do once the war ended. And the increased activity that had come with being the one trading center in North Carolina had to have been a significant development.
You wrote, no other theme encapsulate the social significance of Easter throughout the 1800s as prominently as the boarding school. And that is the female boarding school.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, it's this is a significant and maybe the most difficult idea to explain. But education involves talking about and passing on the important ideologies of that area in which education is taking place. Mm-hmm. It's about money. It's about trying to present yourself as an arbiter of these ideas, of these discourses, of these ideologies, of the predominant economic, affluent class that is in control of the area. And they were trying to appeal to that group. And so, in short, they had to adopt the ideas, the concepts of race, the concepts of economy, the concepts of individuality, of what it means to be a subject, the idea of nationhood, the idea of a citizen. These are things that maybe not directly, but implicitly, influenced how Moravians sold the school, and how how in selling this idea of the school impacted their own self-perception and how they started to view themselves. And no Moravian talked about that. But what you see are really important changes as soon as the school is founded, as soon as they even talk about, with the neighbors, with the surrounding population, that we're starting a boarding school for girls. Big changes in the Moravian community start taking place. And I think one of the biggest changes is the segregation of God's Acre. Because they know that there's a chance that one of the students would pass away, and their parents do not want their children buried in a graveyard where an enslaved individual or a person of color is potentially buried. So they recognize the segregated society in which they found themselves. They recognize the discourses about racial difference that they had to adopt, and they acquiesced to it. And they said, yeah, so we have the founding of the boarding school. The litany on Easter is all of a sudden in English. And then other things just start happening after the boarding school in terms of segregation. And I kind of think does the boarding school cause that? No, I think it's just kind of this pivotal institution. It's the institution of education that is established here. Not just, Moravians have always been about educating their own and even others. But when they started the boarding school, they're appealing to a different audience, and in doing that appeal, in particular in the South and at Salem, you see changes in the congregation happening right in line with the development of the school. So that's why I say it's one of the most significant, if not the most significant, event for the Americanization, or adopting some of these concepts about self-identity.
What are changes to other institutions in the Moravian communities in Wachovia that are indicative of the assimilation into broader American and even Southern identity that you noticed?
So I think the Synod of 1818 is crucial for this one. And at the Synod of 1818, the American congregations asked for the ban against military service to be lifted. In 1812, they say we have to get behind our fatherland. And this is a huge change. So the institution of nationalism is huge, because the Moravian Church at first always urged their members to look at the place where they lived as a host nation. They are not of that nation. They are of a God's empire, ein Gottesreich. And in 1812, Moravians in the South are calling America their fatherland. So they've given up that idea already. 1818, they asked to lift the ban on military service. They ask, so spiritually, they're starting to move away from some of the very significant aspects in that regard too. They want to remove the use of the lot for marriage. And so the institution of marriage is changing. They want to decide themselves. They want to marry the person whom they desire, not someone decided by the lot, or that's God is determining the lot. And so they're saying, no, we want an individual choice. They want more individual control over commercialism. So the institution of commercialism changes. It goes from being controlled, by the governing bodies within the congregation to individual choice. The potter can make more coffee mugs. The potter wants to sell things that the surrounding community wants to buy. And so the whole pressure of the market is starting to impact the way Moravians view commercialism. And all of this happens following the war. And in 1818, that's another kind of bellwether moment. You have the boarding school, 1803, the Synod of 1818, when they ask for these changes in all these institutions in their theology with the lot, the institution of marriage, the institution of education, the institution of commercialism, the institution of self-identity in terms of nationality. All of that changes, and you see those changes happening in 1818 for sure.
You wrote about the considerable influence of Enlightenment ideas in race and gender on American society. Can you talk a bit about those ideas in relation to the early Moravian idea of spiritual equality?
Yeah, that's. I'll try to break that question down into two parts. Um, the Enlightenment is interesting because on its surface, it seems like the exit finally of the Dark Ages, right? So this is when science takes over. This is when rational and logical behavior supplants superstition. Um, and it's enlightenment. That's what it's called, right? We're bringing light into all these dark recesses of our lives, and we're starting to understand nature. And there's also this sense that it's good and it's morally good. All the decisions we're doing, these advancements, these technological advancements, are for increased civility, increased moral behavior, an increase in, you have religious acceptance, like Frederick the Great, giving citizenship to Jews for the first time in Prussia. So there are all these kind of events, the whole notion of the enlightened ruler. But there have been a lot of studies recently that have shown that these ideas, these scientific ideas of Kant, of Hegel, the whole concept of or the discourse upon which American independence was based, was produced by thinkers spending their time having the luxury to sit in a salon, drink some coffee, and have these lengthy discussions. And the whole concept of the Enlightenment is built on the back of commercialism, on the increasing wealth that Europe had during this time through trade, and the institution upon which if not all, the majority of this trade was slavery. And so you have slavery, the institution of slavery, being the economic engine that enabled the development of all these ideas, these enlightened ideas. And so you have a contradiction of this concept of increasing civility, development of civilization, cultivation, all these good definitions of how increased knowledge can improve society on the back of the institution of slavery. So the increase in libraries, the increase in museums is all funded by slave owners or by people who own plantations, sugar planters, wealthy British slave owners in Jamaica, in the Americas, throughout the Caribbean. And that's funding this Enlightenment project. And so you have this blight, this institution that is supporting this whole structure of enlightenment is completely immoral.
Yeah.
It is, it's something that does not jibe at all with the Enlightenment concept of morality, of civility. And so you have this interesting case of we're purporting that we are such a great society, but at the same time we're practicing something completely immoral. And so they have to hide it. And so that's what the Enlightenment does. And the black enslaved individual becomes a negative foil upon which Europeans come to define race. And they perceive the black individual, the black enslaved individual, as being devoid of creative activity, of intellectual ability. And you see this in many thinkers from Kant to Hume, and especially Thomas Jefferson,
Yep.
who claims that the African, the black enslaved individual, enslaved or free, lacks the ability, the intellectual ability, to achieve what the European white person can achieve. And the reason why they do that is because they can't allow the black individual to contradict the discourse that the Enlightenment has established. And so they have to find a way to make sure that that their discourse of white exceptionalism is not questioned by the potential exceptionalism of a black individual. And so some of the things that they start doing that is happening at the same time that Enlightenment talks about increase in civility is segregation, and making sure that black individuals are never taught a profession, making sure that they're not educated. And the Moravians, they went against that. They would still teach the majority of their enslaved people, if they wanted to, would teach them to read, because they saw that as a crucial aspect of spirituality. But Salem started segregating very early because they have to hide the blight of slavery. They have to hide the visual representation that makes their own exceptionalism possible, what they define as exceptionalism.
Yeah, I mean, they have to go through major cognitive dissonance to, in one hand, be developing the concepts of just human rights and literally just human dignity as inherent, while also all of that being possible or just to be talked about or implemented into certain institutions off of the back of the exploitation of an entire group of people, millions of lives.
Yeah, mental gymnastics for sure. How you get around that, the Declaration of Independence, and then the fact that they have a huge blind spot, as there is a whole group of enslaved individuals, bringing them coffee or bringing them food, plowing their fields, making their harvest possible, constructing the buildings in which they're writing the Declaration of Independence. All of that questions the entire program.
In the records, it seems as the number of outsiders attending Easter service grows, there is an increased concern with evangelism, such as conducting the services in English rather than in their usual German, and inclusivity, but only if you are a white outsider. Well, in correlation, there's an increased consciousness of black attendance at their services, both Moravian and non-Moravian, that leads to greater segregation. Can you dig into why these two contradictions of inclusion and exclusion occurred in Salem?
Yeah, again, this happens after 1800. This happens after the establishment of the boarding school, when race consciousness becomes an important facet of the Moravian narrative. And I think that's really significant. Race consciousness starts in the 1780s. We see that. But actually recording it, putting it into the narrative, putting it into the archival record, happens after the boarding school. So again, the boarding school signifies this liminal moment. Adopting the institution of education is huge. And they start recording the number of people of color who are attending. They didn't do that before. Mm-hmm. They only start doing that after the establishment of the boarding school. They start saying how many people of color were attending the Easter services. I think we can assume in the 1780s and the 1770s there were people of color attending. In fact, we know that, right? We have the very famous 1789 mentioning that the Saul is full and the visitors don't enjoy sitting next to people of color. And so they said, we're going to have to hold people of color back until all of the white Europeans have found a seat. And then if there's room in the back, we will let them in. So already in the 1780s, we see Moravians acquiescing to the racial identity of their neighbors surrounding them, which previously they didn't do. They were, in terms of ritual, they were integrated. But we see there's no mentioning of people of color attending the Easter services until after the boarding school. So that's a really significant moment in terms of narrative and what they want to say. So by that point, I think we can say racial identity has become extremely important. And that's what they start recording. They stop recording that after a while, and that's another significant indicator.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about just all of the different aspects of why these things matter to Moravians at this point in time, and clearly they're probably not going to write down all these exact reasonings because most of this is probably going on subconsciously for them.
100%. Yeah.
But just all these different aspects of being in times of great conflict, being in times of uncertainty, of literally a nation being born, and living in a southern economy, and attempting to have a thriving community and a thriving trades community in a southern economy. But tracing changes to the Easter services gives a real sense of how rapidly the change from integration to complete racial segregation in Wachovia congregations happen. Can you just expand on the timeline and really for me how rapidly that happened?
Yeah, so it does happen rapidly. I think in terms of timeline, significant events, 1760, the death of Zinzendorf, the Revolutionary War, really beginning, 1776, 1783, and then we have that really important piece in the records of 1789, when people talk about no longer wanting to sit in the Easter service with black individuals. So I would mark 1760 as beginning of the change, trying to fit in, trying to remove kind of the strangeness that surrounded Moravian congregations before under Zinzendorf, trying to move that, trying to develop economic sustainability because of the debts that they had. So they had to change the economics. They had to get rid of the general economy. And they got rid of the general economy to kind of fit in a little bit more. So I think, the 1760s, a liminal moment, boarding school, 1803, without question. The Synod of 1818, another really important one. And then ultimately 1822. And 1822 is when they decide to segregate the congregation. So black members, free or enslaved, were no longer worshiping with the white congregation. They develop St. Philip's, they get that going, and it's outside of town. Again, it's this removal of the blight of slavery. They want that outside of town, 2 miles away. They don't want to visually see it. They don't want to recognize it or acknowledge it. And I agree with you. I don't think this happens on a conscious level. These are decisions that possibly conscious, but I think more than anything, these are subconscious decisions that they're making. But yeah, 1722 is the key marker. And I said they made these comments about the race of the visitors after the establishment of the boarding school in 1803. By 1822, when the black congregation is established, they no longer mention the color of the visitors.
Yeah, they don't have to anymore.
In the introduction of our book, we kind of frame this change with 1730. And we have this Leonard Dober who hears Zinzendorf talk about the enslaved in the Caribbean. And he immediately says, oh my gosh, I want to become an enslaved individual and go preach to these people and bring them the gospel. And then 1835, we have Henry Leinbach, who's sitting in a train, and across him is a black individual, and in his diary he records how uncomfortable that experience was as a Southern American. And so we have these two bookends here. So 1730 to 1830, roughly 100 years, that is nothing. That's a really quick change to go from what Dober was talking about to what Henry Leinbach was talking about.
Something that I think makes Bethabara and then Salem unique as Moravian communities is that part of their foundational purpose, and really the essence of their foundational purpose, was to create capital for the Moravian Church. Do you think this motivation as an economic engine influenced their mindset and the changes we've been discussing?
Without question. That's one thing that they requested with the 1818 Synod was greater individual control over commercialism, deciding to adjust to market demands for what they're producing. But you also have the so-called Landgemeinden, the agricultural congregations like Bethania, Hope. These congregations do not have the regulations that the Ortsgemeinde, that Salem had, and they didn't have the prohibition against owning enslaved individuals, or they weren't enforced. And as you mentioned before, in order to compete in the Southern economy, the Moravians saw it necessary to have enslaved individuals. And so what you have is the situation where the economy of the country congregations and the changes that were happening in the country congregations in order to compete fairly within this Southern economy actually influences the congregation, the Salem congregation. So the country congregations and their just ignorance of the regulations against slaveholding comes to influence the regulations about slaveholding in the Ortsgemeinde or the Salem congregation.
I think one of my great fascinations with thinking about the Moravians at first in Bethabara and then as the Trade Center goes over to Salem is really looking at these societies, communities, as interesting examples of that strange juxtaposition, really in so much about like American identity in general, and that's religious freedom and the freedom to make money. And how they, because their purpose was to come down here and to try to relieve some of Zinzendorf's debt, and fund missionary work, that was their purpose. They were trying to make money in a Southern context. Mm-hmm. This was not initially supposed to be like designated as a missionary settlement. How one balances that religious idealism and literally attempting to make a utopian community. That's the reason Salem was in the center of Wachovia. They wanted a general ring of separation from the world, but while still wanting people to come on through and buy their nice stuff. How specifically the people here, you watch them over time have to balance these two things, and eventually money money became the most highly influencing factor in and just in like their religious development as well. So fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like that is like, this is such a great case study in like religious utopianism and the need to make money.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the later years, when we're getting into the 1740s, I think even as early as 1735, you have the governing boards, the minutes of the governing boards, and they start bemoaning the fact that we have lost our way, that we're losing the original idea of the congregation, and maybe we can't get it back. And by 1750, they've recognized that it's the original purpose of the congregation is lost. So they know that they had an ideal, and they lost that ideal. You talk about a utopia. It basically went away, and I think the biggest influence was economy, was commercialism, and behind all of that, obviously, was slavery. Mm-hmm. The slave economy was, or the economy of slavery. The big movers, Belo, Fries, Brits, all these guys owned enslaved individuals. I talked about Leinbach. He actually, I think it was 1835, was really critical of how the goal of the congregation had moved so far away from its original import. Obviously, he had embraced the racial identity of the burgeoning nation. But what's really interesting is a comment by Francis Fries, where he says, "I've never cared for others' problems. I've only been concerned about myself and about myself only. That's been my primary importance." And if anything, there's nothing more American to be said than that. And I think that's so interesting. We have these statements by some of these early Moravians contrasted by these later Moravians 2-3 generations later, and we see, wow, that was a change that happened really, really quickly.
How quickly time changes, how quickly ideology can adapt and adjust to new spaces,
Yeah.
and new economies and new ideas.
Yeah.
So in 2022, the Salem congregation marked the 250th anniversary of their Easter sunrise service with a procession held in both Salem's God's Acre and St. Philip's Graveyard in an effort to confront and make amends for the church's historical ties to slavery. So is it safe to say that we can continue to trace the evolution of Moravian identity in North Carolina through the Easter service?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's too bad that we don't have a diarist whom we could read and kind of follow along and see what's happened over the past few years. How something as mundane as weather has influenced how the event takes place. How things like COVID altered the way the event took place. I think Moravians do still question what is their role within the nation. What is their role as Moravians and as Americans, as U.S. citizens? I think those are questions that they are still asking themselves. And I believe as recently as 2022, so I'm used to saying 17, as recently as 2022, that was a topic of discussion that they were having here at the Bethabara congregation, I believe. And so I do think it could be, it still could be a lens through which to view the changing structure of Moravians, of the structure of their beliefs and identity.
Well, Dr. McAllister, thank you so much for meeting with us today, and it was lovely to have a conversation with you.
No, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Historic Bethabara Park is both a National Historic District and a public city park. Park grounds are open year-round from dawn to dusk. Guided tours are available during visitor center open hours. Moravian Mornings is a production of Historic Bethabara Park. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, shoot the Moravian Mornings team an email at historicbethabarapark@gmail.com. For open hours, information about our events, programs, exhibits, and resources about the Moravians in North Carolina, visit our website at historicbethabarapark.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Come visit the birthplace of Winston-Salem in person at 2147 Bethabara Road, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27106.